The Spotlight, shining a light on podcasts and videos that have caught our attention.
Hi, and welcome to The Spotlight. I'm Jen Spiker, and today I'm highlighting a podcast series recently added to the Vision app. Encounters with Jesus is a Bible teaching series produced by Good News Unlimited. Dr. Gonzalez and Malcolm Pollard take listeners through all the key events, miracles, and teachings of Christ's life in an engaging and relatable way. In this episode, Dr. Ellie takes us back to the start, the story of the birth of Jesus.
The Spotlight with Jen Spiker.
Ellie, this encounter with Jesus, I want to start by asking you a question. Might be a bit personal, maybe not.
Okay.
Where were you born?
Actually, I was born in Switzerland, in a city called Basel.
Okay.
The funny thing is that I came to Australia when I was 4.5, and I'd never been back to Basel. And just before COVID, I actually visited Basel with my family, like 50 years later. Never been back.
Wow.
And it was just fascinating because I walked around Basel and I could recognise things. Imagine that from when I was little, 4.5 years old.
Yeah.
But most people don't know that I was born in Basel. That's because my parents immigrated from Spain to Switzerland to have a better life.
Right.
And they lived there for 10 years, and that's where I was born.
Okay.
But in contrast to that, because this is an encounter with Jesus, so it's not about me. Most people know where Jesus was born. Where was Jesus born, Malcolm?
Well, in Bethlehem, I remember.
See, you know, in Bethlehem. If you go there today, you'd be really surprised to see how close it actually is to Jerusalem. Today, it's like an agricultural town.
Mm-hmm.
It's only about 9 kilometres away from Jerusalem. So it could almost be like a suburb of Jerusalem, right?
Say, yep.
9 kilometres is nothing.
Sure.
It's controlled by the Palestinians today. It's part of the Palestinian area, and it's got about 29,000 inhabitants.
Right.
But if we look back in history, Bethlehem is really a very, very ancient city, and it's been inhabited for many thousands of years. Long before Jesus was born there, it was actually famous for another reason, because it was the town where King David was born, and he was of the royal tribe of Judah. So Bethlehem had been considered like the royal city because Judah's kings had descended from David, right?
Okay.
So it was the right place for Jesus to be born because the biblical prophets had prophesied that he would actually be born in Jerusalem. So today we're looking at the world's first encounter with Jesus at his birth.
Yeah.
I always think it's silly that you can only talk about Jesus' birth when it's Christmas. You know, I mean, like one of the greatest things ever. And you can, like when I was a little kid, my parents were health nuts, literally. I could never have chocolate. But at Easter time, now and then, on some years, we'd get a visitor who would bring an Easter egg for each of the two kids, me and my brother.
Right.
And that was the only time I could have chocolate. And I always thought that was so unfair. Why couldn't I have chocolate at other times of the year, right? It's so good. And it's the same sort of thing. Why can't we talk about the birth of Jesus, you know, even if it's not Christmas?
Right.
So it's interesting why Jesus ended up being born in Bethlehem. You see, the Roman Emperor Augustus had ordered a census of all the empire, and everyone had to go to their ancestral town to be included on the roll, basically, on the census roll. And where you went to depended on the tribe of the head of the family. And Joseph, who was Jesus' father, belonged to the tribe of Judah. It just so happened that Joseph and Mary didn't live in Bethlehem, but they lived in Nazareth in northern Israel. That was more than 111 kilometres away from Bethlehem.
Wow.
Joseph had to trundle along with Mary.
Was heavily pregnant.
Yeah.
That would have been fun.
Yeah, that's right. And this idea that, you know, she rode on a donkey, that's not in the Bible, by the way. People imagine that it must have been, but donkeys only belonged to really rich people. Donkeys were like the
Mercedes or
the Mercedes of the time, right? So it's unlikely. Right? So it would have been a pretty hard journey. If you go to Bethlehem today, the old part of Bethlehem, you can walk around these narrow paved streets flanked by these old-looking stone houses, and you might think that they are ancient, but while they're old, they only go back to the 19th century. There's actually nothing left, Malcolm, of the ancient city that witnessed the birth of Jesus. The remains of the first century city are actually buried below the current city. But that hasn't stopped, you know, Christians from just flocking there, particularly around Christmas time when the tradition says Jesus was born, although we know it was probably around Easter time in the northern part of the world. So let's get some perspective here on Bethlehem. When Jesus was born there over 2,000 years ago, Palestine was a very, very unimportant part of the world, sandwiched between two important Roman provinces, the provinces of Syria and Egypt. And Judea, where Bethlehem was part of the kingdom of Herod the Great, and he ruled as a client king of the Roman emperor. That means he said, yes, sir, no, sir, 2 bags full, sir, to the Roman emperor. And they let him rule as long as he promised to be loyal and to keep Palestine quiet. So Bethlehem was actually a supremely unimportant part of the Roman Empire. But right there, the most important event that ever happened on this earth, apart from the crucifixion and the resurrection of Jesus, happened. The Saviour was born. I always think about how there was no room for him at the inn. It makes me remember when I was last in Jerusalem. I travelled with a friend who prides himself on always booking really cheap accommodation.
Right.
I hope he doesn't hear this. Right?
Here we go.
Yep. And I remember he booked us in the Petra Motel in the heart of Old Jerusalem. Now, this was in a year when Passover and Easter time sort of coincided. You know, Jerusalem was full of people.
Yep.
So we rocked up with, 32 kilos of baggage, at least I did, trundling them through the stone streets because no car could get in there. And, I was just sweating and had it by the time we get there. Only to be told that, no, there was no room for us at the inn either because they had overbooked. And we actually ended up sleeping in the attic.
Right.
Like really it was a storage
aircon,
attic. No aircon, rubbish everywhere and the accumulation of 150 years. This is a really old building of rubbish and old disused mattresses. And I remember that there was a Greek Orthodox priest who the owner had let sleep there for charity as well. And there were only 2 beds. And he was using one of them. And so I took the bed and I remember that I wrapped myself up in as many layers of clothes as I could so I wouldn't touch anything on the bed, right? And I doped myself up with as many antihistamines to make me sleepy as I could. And anyway, the story goes on and on, right? We didn't sleep much. The others just slept on the floor.
Right.
And you could see there were cracks on the floorboard, between the floorboards, like half an inch wide.
Sure.
They had a whole busload of tourists, of pilgrims from Russia who were very religious and singing hymns all night. So, and the light was shining up through the floorboards. It was great. So no room for us in the inn either. But I can imagine that it wasn't great for Joseph. Maybe he laughed about it later, like I did. Basically, Jesus was born in a place where animals are kept. He was laid in a manger, a feeding trough for animals. And they sort of had to put Joseph and Mary at the back. 700 years before, the prophet Micah had written these words, "But you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, though you are little among the thousands of Judah, yet out of you shall come forth to me the one to be ruler in Israel, whose going forth are from old, from everlasting." Those are profound words. I know my parents looked forward to my birth. My mother had many miscarriages before I was born. I was their firstborn son. As much as my parents looked forward to me coming into the world, no one prophesied my arrival 700 years before.
No angels.
No angels. But you see, Jesus was special because he had a special work to do in this world. He was a saviour. He came to be the saviour of the world. I look at the prophecies of Jesus that are so detailed, from his birth, his life, his work, his ministry, his death and his resurrection. And we know that these things were written, like in this case, Micah wrote that Jesus would be born in Bethlehem 700 years before. And we know that's true. We found the book of Micah among the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Yeah.
And so we know that was already written in the time of Jesus, and it wasn't something that was written after the fact. Oh, let's just dodgy up a prophecy to make it look as if, for Christians in the future to prove that they are right.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
Yeah.
The amazing thing here is that it also tells us that Jesus going forth are from old, from everlasting. That means that even though Jesus was born in Bethlehem, something like 2,000 years ago, that's not when Jesus began. He had an existence from eternity, and he has an existence that will continue into eternity, and tells us that Jesus is much more than just another man. If the prophet was right about where he was to be born, then I think he's right about who Jesus is as well, that he is God himself. And I love it that the Saviour who was born in Bethlehem, the Saviour who's going forth from everlasting, is still, if I can say it, going forth today. He's going into every heart to see if there's room for him. And I've welcomed him in. Have you, Malcolm?
Absolutely.
Yeah. I hope you do too.
On the Spotlight, we've been listening to Dr. Ellie Gonzalez tell the story from the Gospels of Jesus' birth. If you want to read it yourself, you'll find it in Luke chapter 2. To speak to someone about welcoming Jesus into your heart, call 1-800-PRAY-FOR-ME. That's 1-800-772-936. The prayer team will be happy to answer any questions you have and pray with you. Again, that number is 1-800-772-936. New episodes of Encounters with Jesus are added to the Vision app each week. Find them by tapping the podcast tab and searching for Encounters with Jesus. If you have a favourite podcast or video series that should be featured, click Contact Us at vision.org.au and share the link. My name is Jen Spiker. Join me next time as I highlight another podcast or video on the Spotlight.
For more great podcasts and videos like the one featured today, check out vision.org.au or the free Vision app.